Hello Lime class, hello Year 6 or whoever's watching. Hello and welcome. I'm Mrs Campbell, as you know, and I'd like to do some story time with you. As you know, this week as a school, we are celebrating Children in Need and trying to raise awareness for children in need on Friday the 13th. And as a school, we thought it would be lovely to share a story with you at bedtime. And so to help you feel cozy and all wrapped up, you'll come to school in your pyjamas on Friday. So I'm at home now in my children's bedroom in my pyjamas, and I thought it'd be lovely to share a story with you. So I hope that's okay. What I thought would be nice is to share with you our class books. You know, this term we've started to read Goodnight, Mr. Tom, and I'm going to read a little bit more with you. So at school we've read chapters 1, 2, and 3, and this week we've moved on to 4 and 5. So I'm going to start reading to you chapter 6 today, and that's where we have a new character called, I can put them in there, called Zach. So chapter 6 is called Zach, and I think Woody's going to meet a new character called Zach. So let's see what Zach is like and what we can infer about his character. So sit back, relax, get all nice and cozy. I'm cozy here. I just show you. I've got my pajamas, I've got my blanket on, I've got my little teddy bear like Eeyore and Winnie the Pooh. So I've got my teddies nice and cozy. So please make sure that you are comfortable and cozy too, so that you can sit back, relax and enjoy. So here we go. Chapter 6, Zach. Hello, he said brightly, grasping Willy's hand. There was a loud squelching of mud as he shook it. Sorry, gasped Willy in embarrassment. The strange boy grinned and wiped it on the sleeves of his shorts. You're William Beach, aren't you? Willy nodded. Pleased to meet you. I'm Zacharias Wrench. Oh, said Willy. Yes, I know. It's a mouthful, isn't it? My parents have a cruel sense of humour. Uncle Zach for short. The strange boy's eyes seemed to penetrate so deeply into Willy's that he felt sure he could read his thoughts. He averted his gaze and began hurriedly to cover the Anderson again. I say, can I help? I'd like to. Willy was quite taken aback at being asked. I'm rather good at it, actually, he continued proudly. I've given a hand at the creation of several. I wouldn't mess it up. Yeah, replied Willy quietly, if you want. Thanks, I say, he said, as he dumped a handful of earth on the side of the shelter. I'll show you around. Do you like exploring? Willy shrugged his shoulders. I don't know. Is it your first visit to the country? But before Willy could reply, the boy was already chattering on. It's not mine exactly. I've had odd holidays with friends and my parents, but this is the first time I've actually sort of lived in the country. I've read books that are set in the country and of course poems, and I've lived in towns near the country and gone into the country on Sundays and when there was no school. He stopped and there was a moment of silence as they carried on working. You've not been here long, have you? He asked after a while. Willy shook his head. Oh, so I'm sure I would have seen you around. You're different. Willy raised his head nervously. Am I? Yes, I sensed that as soon as I saw you. There's someone there, I thought to myself, who's a bit of a loner, an independent sort of soul, like myself, perhaps. Willy glanced quickly at him. He felt quite tongue-tied. You're living with Mr. Oakley, aren't you? He nodded. He's a bit of a recluse, I believe. What? Said Willy. A recluse, you know, keeps himself to himself. Oh, I say, said Zach suddenly, we'll be at school together, won't we? He shrugged his shoulders again. I don't know. He felt somewhat bewildered. He couldn't understand this exuberant friendliness in a boy he'd only just had a glimpse of twice. It was all too fast for him to take in. I expect you think I'm a bit forward, remarked Zach. What? Forward, you know. But you see, my parents work in the theatre, and I'm so used to moving from town to town that I can't afford to waste any time. So as soon as I see somebody that I like, I talk to them. Willy almost dropped the clod of earth he was holding. No one had ever said that they liked him. He'd always accepted that no one did. Even his mum said she only liked him when he was quiet and still. For her to like him, he had to make himself invisible. He hurriedly put the earth on the shelter. I say, said Zach after a while, I can't reach the top. Is there a ladder indoors? Willy nodded. Where is it? In the hall. It's Mr. Tom's. He won't mind, will he? I don't know, whispered Willy in a little panic-stricken voice. I'll take the blame if there's any trouble, said Zach. I say, maybe we can finish it and put the ladder back before he returns. It'll be a surprise then, won't it? Willy nodded dumbly. Lead the way then, cried Zach. On, and with that They made their way towards the back door. Meanwhile, after walking in almost total darkness with no lights to guide him save the fast darkening sky, Tom had reached the village hall. It came as quite a shock to enter the bright building so lit up. He shaded his eyes and blinked for a few seconds until he had adjusted to the change. There were far more people than he had anticipated, and the buzz of excitement chatter was quite deafening. He tried to slip in unnoticed, but it was too late. He had already been spotted by Mrs. Miller. "Well, Mr. Oakley," she burbled, "this is a surprise." He turned to frown her into silence. She was decked out in her Sunday best clothes. A pink billabong hat was perched precariously on her head, and pinned to it on its side was a large artificial purple flower. It hung, half suspended, over her motley pudgy cheeks. The hat could have been a continuation of her face, Tom thought. The colours were so similar. He cleared his throat. "Vicar called the meeting, so here I am." "Yes, of course," said Mrs. Miller. He glanced quickly around the hall. Some of the older boys were already in uniform, their buff-coloured boxes slung over their shoulders. Mr. Peters, Charlie Ruddles, and Mr. Bush were seated all in the front row, Miss Thatcher and Mr. Butcher. He slipped quietly to the back of the hall, catching sight of Nancy and Dr. Little, and acknowledged their presence with a slight gesture of his hand. He attempted to stand inconspicuously in a corner, but it was useless, for most of the villagers just nudged one another and turned to stare in his direction. Tom, as Zack said, kept himself to himself. He didn't hold meetings or village functions. Since his wife, Rachel's death, he hadn't joined in any of the social activities in Little Wereworld. In his grief, he had cut himself off from the people, and when he had recovered, he had lost the habit of socializing. "Evening, Mr. Oakley," said Mrs. Fletcher, who was busy knitting in the back row. "Left the boy, have you?" "With Sam," he added, by way of defence. He had been surprised at Sam's willingness to stay, and he even felt a flicker of jealousy when he had flopped contentedly down in the grass beside the boy's feet. Although most wireless owners had opened their doors so that people could listen to the King's message, Mr. Peters talked about it for those who had missed it. He mentioned the regulations regarding the blackouts and the carrying of gas masks, and Mr. Thatcher, the tall ginger-haired father of the two girls and their dark-haired sister, he spoke about the procedure of action during the air raid. Gumboots and oilskins were given out and ordered for volunteers, and it was decided that the first air raid post would be at Dr. and Nancy's little cottage, and that the village hall would be the rest centre. Mrs. Miller threw her puffy arm into the chair and volunteered to run a canteen for any troops that might pass through. This suggestion was greeted with howls of laughter at the idea of anyone bothering to take a route that included a Little Wereworld. However, Lillian Peters, seeing how hurt Mrs. Miller was, said that she thought it would be a good idea, and after suggesting that a weekly gathering of the evacuated mothers and their infants would also be an excellent idea, Mrs. Miller sat down beaming, because she believed that she had thought of it all by herself. Mr. Bush announced that Mrs. Black had agreed to help at the school, as there would be an extra 70 children attending. She was a quietly spoken old lady who had been retired for 70 years. "Going to have her hands full with some of those town lot," Tom remarked to himself. Several people volunteered for being special constables, but Tom remained silent. His life had been well ordered and reasonably happy, he thought, by minding his own business. The last thing he wanted was to turn himself into a do-gooder. But he realized very quickly that most of the volunteers were genuinely and sincerely opening their hearts and their homes. Mr. Thatcher stood up to talk about fire-watching duties. "No one is allowed to do more than 48 hours a month," he said. "Just a couple of hours a day." Tom raised his arm. Mr. Peters looked towards the back of the hall in surprise. "Yes, Tom?" he asked. "Did you wish to say something?" "I'm volunteering like," he said. "I beg your pardon," said Mr. Thatcher in amazement. "I'll do the 2 hours a day, early in the morning, or tea time. Can't leave the boy alone at night." "No, no, of course not." And his name was hurriedly written down on the piece of paper. There was a murmur of surprise and enthusiasm in the hall. A tall, angular figure stood up. It was Amelia Thorne. "Put mine there too," she said, "and while I'm about it, anyone who would like to join our amateur dramatics group is very welcome. Meetings now on Thursdays, which means you can still attend practices at the first aid post on Wednesdays." Soon a dozen or so hands were raised, and after their names had been written down and the details of what their duties would involve, the meeting was brought to a close. It was dark then, and Tom stepped out of the hall. He strode away towards the arched lane, while the sound of chatter and laughter behind him gradually faded away. He recollected in his mild stupor that Mrs. Fletcher and Amelia Thorne had spoken to him, and that the doctor had asked after William, and had said something about their boy being over at his place. It was pitch black under the overhanging branches, and it wasn't until he reached the gate of Dobbs Fields that he was able at last to distinguish the shapes of the trees, and Dobbs and the wall and the churchyard. He swung open the gate and shut it firmly behind him. Bet Rachel's having a good laugh, he muttered wryly to himself, for not only had he volunteered for fire-watching duties, but he had also volunteered the services of Dobbs and the cart since there was news of petrol rationing. He strolled over to the nag and slapped her gently. "I'll have to get you a gas mask then soon, old girl, won't I? Seems we're both up to our necks in it now." The stars were scattered in fragments across the sky, and Tom stared up to them. It didn't seem possible that there was a war. The night was so still and peaceful. And then he suddenly remembered Willie. "Hope he's got some sense. He's gone inside," he mumbled to himself, and he headed in the direction of home. He opened the little back gate and peered around in the dark for the shelter. He would have bumped into it if he hadn't heard voices. "William? William? Where is you?" "Here, Mr. Tom," said a voice by his side. Tom squinted down at him. "Ain't you got sense enough to go indoors? You'll catch a cold in that wet jersey." A loud scrabbling came from inside the Anderson, and Sam leapt out of the entrance and tugged excitedly at his trousers. Tom picked him up, secretly delighted that he hadn't been deserted in affection. Sam licked his face, panting and barking. "It was my idea," said a cultured voice, "to keep at it." "Who's that?" asked Tom sharply. "Me, Mr. Oakley," and he felt a hard hand touch his shirt sleeve. Tom screwed up his eyes to look at Zack. He could make out what looked like a girl in the darkness. "I just thought it was a shame to go inside in such a night like this," he continued, "so I persuaded Will to partake of my company for a while." "Who's Will?" asked Tom bluntly. "My name is William. He told me he was called Willie, but I thought that was a jolly awful thing to do to anyone. Willie just cries out for ridicule, don't you think? I mean," he went on, "it's almost as bad as Zacharias Reg." "What?" said Tom. "Zacharias Reg. That's me. Zack for short." "Oh." Willie stared at their silent silhouettes in the darkness for what seemed an eternity. He could hear only the sound of Sam's tongue lathering Tom's face and a gentle breeze gliding through the trees. "Best come in," said Tom at last. They clattered into the hallway. Tom put the blacks up in the front room, crashed around in the darkness, and lit the gas and oil lamps. After he had made a pot of tea, they sat near the range and surveyed each other. William's face, hair, and clothes were covered all in earth. His filthy hands showed up starkly against his white mug that he was holding. Zack, Tom discovered, was a voluble, curly-haired boy, a few months older than Willie, only taller and in bad need, so he thought of a haircut. A red jersey was draped around his bare shoulders, and a pair of frayed, rather colourful men's braces held up some well-darned green shorts. Apart from his sandals, his legs were bare. "You finished the shelter then?" said Tom. Willie nodded and glanced in Zack's direction. He helped. "By the feel of it, you've done a good job. How'd you reach the top?" There was a pause. "With a ladder," said William huskily. "Yes," intercepted Zack. "That was my idea." "Oh, was it now?" "Yes." "You put it back then?" "Oh, yes. It might be a bit earth-stained, though." Tom poked some tobacco in his pipe and relit it. Where are you staying then? You ain't from round here." "With Dr. and Mrs. Little. I've been here for about a week now." "Oh," said Tom. "I haven't seen you around." "I haven't seen you around either," said Zack. Willie choked on a mouthful of tea, and Zack slapped his back. He flinched. His skin was still bruised and sore. "I say," blurted out Zack with concern, "you're not one of those delicate mortals, are you?" "No, he ain't," said Tom sharply. "Leastways, not for long." Zack glanced at the clock in the bookcase and stood up. "I say," he exclaimed, "it's 9 o'clock. Thanks awfully for the tea, Mr. Oakley. May I come round tomorrow and see Will?" "Up to William. Ask him." Willie was so exhausted from the day's labours that he didn't know whether he had dreamt the last remark or not. "Can I?" said Zack earnestly. "I've a marvellous idea for a game." "Yeah." "Wizard. Kalu Kali." With a great effort, he attempted to pull his jersey on over his head. He tugged and he pulled at it until he eventually moved over its nose and causing his hair to spring up in all directions like soft wire. Phew, he gasped. I did it. Mother says I mustn't grow any more till she's collected enough wool to knit me a bigger one. He tugged the sleeves of his jersey down, but they slid stubbornly back to between his wrists and elbows. Good night, Sam, he said, giving him a pat. William, said Tom, see your friend out. Willie stood sleepily to his feet and followed Zack into the hallway, closing the door behind him. Oh, cried Zack as his knee hit the step ladder. Willie opened the front door. The sky was still starry, and a cool breeze shook the grass between the gravestones, and he shivered. Your jersey's awfully damp, said Zack, feeling it. Don't go catching pneumonia. He glanced cautiously around the graveyard. Just looking for spies, he explained. Look, about my idea, you know, Captain McBlade. Do you mean Charlie Ruddles? No, said Zack excitedly. Captain McBlade of the Air Police. Is he Prime Minister or something? No, he took another look around. I'll tell you more about it tomorrow. Roger Wilco and out. Willie watched him walk down the path and towards the church. He pulled himself up over the wall and disappeared. Who was Roger Wilco, and what did he mean by out? He thought. He stepped back into the hall and felt his way back into the living room. And that's, children, where we'll stop for now. I hope you've enjoyed the story time. I hope you have a lovely night's rest and we can continue the story together at school another day. Night, night.